is when you're following as an agent a different agenda, your own agenda. So we find the CMIT guilty of slippage. The slippage was that the committee in its deliberation gradually pushed for more liberalization than the codes prescribed. Somehow I thought I had a table here that is missing. Anyway, I think, okay, there's a literature review, but it's 10 after 12, and I only have 30 more minutes to go, and I've just barely finished the introduction. So I won't show you the table, not least because I forgot to put it on the slideshow. But I will tell you briefly, the table summarizes the literature. When we look at the literature on explanations for why financial globalization happened in the past, since the 1960s, say. We look at the past 20 years literature on what has happened since the 1960s. There are about more or less 100, 120 serious publications on this, either books or definitely journal articles. And we find that whereas in the 1990s, the explanations were mostly state-centered explanations, trying to understand financial globalization as an intergovernmental bargain, such as Story and Voltaire, famous book, Battle of the Systems. Or there have been explanations in terms of domestic politics. Who wins, who loses from liberalization? The main publication being Jeff Frieden's 1991 book on Latin American liberalizations. What we see in the 2000s are a few new literature. One is the constructivist literature, a lot of trying to explain how ideas changed in people's minds. That liberalization is not only a matter of state interest and or particular sector interest within a country, it's a mindset. The fact that you come to regard it as something desired at all is to be understood. It's an intellectual revolution. In the Keynesian world, in the Bob Mundell world, I'm talking about the 1950s and the early 1960s, it was almost a heresy. To say that you should open your economy to free capital flows only meant you'll subject yourself to major disruptions. Capital for the sake of capital, to be distinguished from financing of trade and direct investments, just hot money, was not desired. It didn't seem like it had anything productive to contribute to an economy. And so it was limited. Then something happened. People changed their minds. So constructivists try to trace this process of how this happened, either by a new generation educated at some universities, a la Milton Friedman, then getting positions in important institutions and promoted to policy-making positions. Then there's a literature on multi-level governance, which explains developments not in terms of particular state interest or particular sector, but in terms of an array of governing bodies, including states and parties, but also international organizations, transnational actors. The EU is, of course, the main field of study for such literature, but also including what we call the instrumental use of ideas. Changing your mind truly such that the opposite becomes unthinkable is a cognitive revolution. Buying an idea for a material interest is something else. Okay? So if a commission official suggests an idea of policy, how to proceed with something, he may win great acceptance without people really thinking in their minds that he is right. It's just that it works, and it's a focal point for compromise and for collective policy making, so they go along. And again, I can't develop this too much here, but what we don't see is the principal agent analysis. This is missing, and we find it odd because you cannot think of serious international cooperation without agency. At some point, you need a body of experts to manage this very complicated issue area. And since you need an agent for cooperation, this is the right, we think, the right framework for analysis. So there's a theoretical innovation to it as well. Okay, the CMIT is the agent. It reports directly to the Council. I don't have a flow chart here of how the OECD is built, plus it has changed throughout the years a bit. But aside from the various departments and institutes that are associated with the OECD, it has a council which establishes committees to take care of particular issues and ad hoc working groups as well. So the body that we're talking of reports directly to the Council. It has a code, that's the contract, the Code of Liberalization, of capital movements, and another less germane code of current and visible operations, but still relevant. Okay, I'm going to skip this because of our time constraint. Important to note that in the delegated task, the code clearly stipulates in its original form that liberalization is to be sought only to the extent necessary for effective economic cooperation. This formulation, by the way, repeats itself in the Treaty of Rome, in the European Union. Whoever speaks of 4 freedoms, it's very common, it's wrong. The EU, until the Maastricht Treaty, had 3.5 freedoms. Because capital mobility was desired in the Treaty of Rome to the extent necessary for the single market, which many countries, including the ECJ, the European Court of Justice as well, ruled that that means that you shall liberalize your capital flows only to the extent that physical trade and trade in services need to take place, not for its own sake. So this is again the old Keynesian way of thinking. Also, there was a recognized variance in state, on the situation different states were at. Now we're all expected to proceed at the same pace. So there are 2 lists, and again, we don't have too much time to detail them, but it worked like there were 2 lists, List A and List B. List A included various transactions that once you liberalize, you cannot go back on it. It's one way, it's ratchet. List B, you can still go back on your liberalization. There were some measures that could impede capital mobility that were not included in either of the lists. Again, to show you that the intent was not a universal capital mobility. And especially, all transactions with maturity of less than 1 year were excluded. The CMIT had representatives from member states, but we argue it was not an intergovernmental body. First of all, the number of representatives on the committee was smaller than half the number of member states. Not every member state had a representative on the CMIT. That changed in the middle of the 1980s. But until then, it wasn't like that. The representatives were appointed for a year, renewable. In practice, they served for many years, even as much as a decade on the committee. It was a full-time job. They were not expected to do anything else while being members of the committee. And they discussed the problems that they were facing on a personal basis, since nothing that they decided nothing in the discussions committed any member state